So thank you so much for having me here. I'm really glad to be a part of this event and really looking forward to the dialogue with all of you. So let me start by asking a kind of a goofy question. How many of you have played the board game Life? Anybody? Oh, lots of people played the board game Life. Excellent. I always feel like that, that means we're, I'm speaking to my people. My kids love the board game Life. If you move to the next slide, you'll see. So the way the board game Life works is you spin a little dial, and you move from, you move your little plastic car from the beginning to the end of a typical, board game path, right? What's crazy about this game is that the winner, and what's crazy is that my kids actually, they've managed to make this fun, right? And my kids love this. The winner is the person who ends the game with the most savings for retirement. That's actually the goal. And along the path, you make exactly 3 decisions. You decide whether to go to college or get straight to work after high school. You decide whether to buy a house or rent and what houses to buy. That seems to be the really fun part, the imagining the houses that you might own. And you decide whether or not to have children, and you roll a dice for how many children you have. And in a complete, disregard for reality, it's actually financially better for you to have more children, which we know not to be true. And like this idea of like this being the way the game of life works, and you can click through the next slides, is really part of how we think about American economic lives. Like we have this idealized version of a life cycle. You'd graduate from college or high school, you'd go to work, you'd get progressively better jobs over time, and I'm actually on the next slide. You get progressively better jobs over time, save some of your money, at the end retire. And in the meantime, you would just make a handful of very big decisions with big consequences, like whether or not to buy a home, whether or not to have children. And this way of thinking about a financial life is so important in the way we think about it in the US that it's completely embedded in the tax code, right? So Aman was mentioning the tax bill. The big tax subsidies for savings in either the old or the new tax bill are about home ownership and about retirement savings and about education savings, because we're acknowledging that we think those are the 3 big decisions people make. And in that model of an economic life, what really matters is slow and steady saving. So I'm on the next slide. So the idea is, how do we help people not spend for today in order to have resources later? That's the big objective. And yet, in this research that I had the great fortune to work on, we saw that we got to go much deeper than that. So through the generosity of the Ford Foundation, the Citi Foundation, and the Omidyar Network. Sorry, maybe I'll just end up skipping the slides because it's sort of awkward for us to constantly go back and forth. But I was able to partner with NYU, with a professor there named Jonathan Mordock, and really get to know deeply the financial lives of Americans. And we could assess, like, are people really living on this life cycle arc? And so what we did is we worked with families in 4 different locations in the US. Thank you. We worked with families here in New York, in Brooklyn and Queens. We worked with families in Ohio, along the Ohio-Kentucky border. We worked with families in Mississippi and in California. And it's not a statistically representative sample, because we worked with 235 families, but it is a representative view into American life, right? Urban, rural, black, white, immigrants, non-immigrants. And so we felt like that gave us a good sense of what people are going through. As diverse as the sample is, the one common thread is that everybody was working. Every household has somebody working when we started working with them. And the households were earning between the poverty line and about twice the poverty line. So that's roughly the low end of the middle class, or low and moderate income people. So it was a picture of, not the poorest nor the richest in any community, but people who are working hard and experiencing struggles along the way. We collected a huge amount of data. So the idea was, go to the next slide, that we worked with families for a full year, and we had field researchers who went out and met with the families every few weeks, and they collected huge volumes of data. The idea was to gather information about every dollar that came in and out of people's homes. So, and that really sets it apart. So typical financial research in the US is a snapshot in time. And sometimes it asks backward-looking questions like, how much did you earn this year? But for the most part, you get a moment. Or on the other end of the spectrum, you do focus group research where you get people's perceptions and their stories. But what was different about this research is that we were able to do both. And we were able to gather information from people over the course of a year so we could really understand their financial lives. And what emerges are stories like this one I'll tell about Becky and Jeremy. If you move to the next slide, I have a visual for Becky and Jeremy. So Becky and Jeremy live in Ohio, not so far from a major city, but not quite urban. And they look from the outside like a middle-class family. They have a house that they own, they have 2 cars. Jeremy works full-time, Becky does some part-time work along the way when they need extra cash. They have 3 kids, and they've lived in their town for, Becky and Jeremy both grew up in the town that they live in. And yet, on the day that my co-author, Jonathan Murdoch, was talking to Becky, on one of the days, she was in a terrible mood, like really bad. And she was sort of hand-wringing about a financial decision she had to make. What she said is, I have the cash on hand now to pay my mortgage, but I don't know if I should. And it was sort of like eating away at her mind, right? It was this nagging worry in her head about, like, the bill's not due for 3 weeks, but I'm going to think about it between now and then constantly unless I just pay it. I kind of want to get done with it. I want to pay it, be over with it. And yet she said, but if I pay it and then my husband's next paycheck is crap, her words, then I'll have to borrow from my sister, and I hate borrowing from my sister. And so, we're digging into her dad and saying, well, why, what's the story with Jeremy's paycheck? Why would his next paycheck be crap, right? So Jeremy works full time. He's an auto mechanic. He fixes long haul trucks. And he shows up 40 hours a week, but he gets paid on commission. So his pay varies depending on how many trucks break. And so in the winter and the summer, when more trucks break, for reasons that I won't pretend to understand, because I don't understand cars, right? He makes more money. In the fall and the spring, less money. And this was in October. And so she wasn't really sure, like, where are we, right? What's going to happen at this part of, what's next week's paycheck going to bring? And this story turns out to be really common in our sample. So if you go to the next slide, here's one of the few places where I would say, yes, look at the slide. So we counted the number of months in which people's incomes were either meaningfully more or meaningfully less than their average paycheck. And what we found was that in 5 months of the year for which we collected data, on average, in 5 months of the year, people had meaningful spikes or dips in their income. As a benchmark for whether or not a spike or a dip was meaningful, we used 25%. Because there's been other research around whether or not people's incomes change from year to year, right? We're looking within the year, but people have been looking at these longitudinal data sets and assessing whether year-over-year volatility is changing. And economists have been using 25% plus or minus as the benchmark. So that seemed like the natural thing to tie to. But the reality is that the spikes and dips we saw averaged 50% more or less than the average. So, you think about traditional budgeting advice. It's figure out your monthly income, figure out your monthly expenses, subtract the two, that's what you can spend on fun stuff, right? That's how we tell people to budget. But that's completely inconsistent with the structure of Becky and Jeremy's financial life. And it's inconsistent with the structure of a lot of people's financial life. And what's going on is really a hollowing out of the labor force. So, you can't have avoided hearing that manufacturing in the US has declined. Also super hard to avoid hearing about the gig economy, the rise of companies like Uber. What's going on is something actually much more structural and deeper than either of those data points tell you. What's happening is a hollowing out of middle class, middle skill jobs, or at least the jobs that used to be middle class, middle skill, And what's rising are low-wage jobs and high-wage jobs. And combined with that is, and so my co-author Jonathan and I ended up thinking about this as the great job shift. Because, so that's going on. And at the same time, really as a result of productivity enhancing changes, companies have figured out how to share a lot of risk with their workforce. Right? So large retailers, for example, can use data to know exactly how many salespeople they need on the floor Wednesday at 4 versus Friday at 2. They can send, restaurants, others, like people can send their workers home when business is not busy. They can pay on commission the way that Jeremy is paid. And what they're really doing is they're sharing the risk and ups and downs in demand for their services with their workforce. And that has huge consequences for people's earnings, people's income, and people's security. And then we're going to layer onto that, like understanding of how people spend, right? What happens on the other side of your budgeting exercise? And what we found, if you go to the next slide, is that, and click through the next, there's going to be a line that shows up, is that spending was just as spiky as earnings. And that's not surprising when you think about your own life, right? Christmas, about to be expensive. September is expensive if you have kids. The summer often has additional childcare costs. The medical, and that it doesn't even get into the fact that medical comes up when it comes up, and people pay a much bigger share of those costs than they used to. And of course, homes need maintenance, cars need maintenance. And all of that spikiness in spending is harder at the lower end of the income spectrum, right? Because for a few reasons. One, if you have less money, you're gonna buy a used car, and that's gonna break down more, right? If you have, right, so there are inherently sort of risks that are exacerbated by having fewer resources. It's also the case that income has not kept pace with the cost of living. So wages, particularly at the lower end, have really stayed stagnant on a real basis for the last several decades. And at the same time, the cost of housing, the cost of transportation, the cost of healthcare, education, they've all gone up. So our typical advice is, save. That's how you'll manage this up and down spikiness of your financial life, right? Save, and then you'll spend your savings down when you need to. But because people have rising expenses relative to their earnings, the cushion between those two, the slack between those two, is much smaller. And so it's actually a really hard thing to do to expect people to save to manage this ongoing mismatch. And what I would argue is that the fact that people have less slack, the fact that they have more volatility, the fact that they have greater risk, it's a feature of our current economic life. It's not a bug that a handful of people are experiencing. It is part and parcel with the increased amount of flexibility that we expect our workforce to have, and the competitive pressures and expectations around productivity and profitability that we put companies under. And so these aren't sort of experiences that one family has. They're systemic and they're structural, and we have to think of them as such if we're going to solve them well. And so that throws on its head sort of this assumption that you have with the life cycle arc, that the main goal is to help people save for the future. And so if they're not saving for the future, then the assumption is, well, they must be overspending today, right? That's the problem. So how do we help them not overspend today? But what we actually see is that people are saving for soon. They're saving for 3 months from now or 6 months from now. So if you go to the next slide, what we saw in the diaries was that 17% of the income flows that we were gathering data about flowed into savings accounts. But it didn't stay there. It got spent within 3 months or 6 months or the year. And when we asked people when they expected to spend their savings, they mostly said, well, this savings will be spent within the next 3 years. That was the time horizon. And so what you see is this idea of people who are saving, they have the behavior of saving, but they don't have any accumulation of savings. And so they don't have the security that comes from what we think savings will give you. So I'm going to skip the next slide and go to this one, which is, I think, really interesting. So we started sharing this research from the Diaries a few years ago, and early findings. And the wonderful thing about that was that it inspired other people to start asking related questions. And so the Federal Reserve does this annual survey called the Survey of Household and Economic Decision Making. And they started asking people about volatility and to what extent it causes you to feel financial hardship or be late paying bills. They also asked this sort of open-ended question about what are your financial worries, and what concerns you in your financial life. And they made this funny word cloud. Word cloud is not super scientific, but they made this word cloud to show you what people answer. And the biggest, for households with incomes of over $100,000 a year, the biggest word here is retirement. And that's because people with higher incomes probably are living on the life cycle arc. That is where their heads are. And so they're thinking about retirement, they're thinking about college, health is on here in a big way. When you contrast that with the next word cloud of households who have under $40,000 a year in income, retirement's still there, but it's a small word down to the bottom left. And what replaces it is bills, money. And so it confirms this idea that we had been playing with in the Diaries, that people aren't really just simply balancing between what they need now and what they need later. They're thinking about what they need soon. And so I'll come back to Becky and Jeremy, and then I'm going to stop talking in a moment, because I do really want to have questions and discussion with all of you. But so how does Becky deal with that? Becky stockpiles. So her freezer is full. Her pantry is full. She says, I'm never going to have to buy toothpaste again, and she does it for a few reasons. What she says is, from an economic perspective, what she's doing is smoothing her consumption. She's making sure she can spend whatever, she can still consume what she needs to consume regardless of the spikes and dips in their earnings. But she's doing it in a way that really acknowledges her own failings as a human. She says it's just easier to save in pork chops than it is to save in cash in the bank. Cash in the bank, she makes a joke. She says you can't buy movie tickets with a pork chop. And she's self-aware about what's going to work for her. So she has bank accounts, right? They have a savings account, they have checking accounts, but that's not really where she's doing her savings. The other thing she does, and this is really counterintuitive, particularly I think if you're upper middle class, is that she maximizes the spikes. So she over withholds on her taxes, and what she's doing is creating as big of a tax refund as possible. So they claim more dependents than they have. And that's counterintuitive, partly because you think, well, if the problem is volatility, then isn't the answer to smooth it out? But that's not the case. The fact is there are moments when a spike is incredibly useful. You have to put down a down payment on a new car. You have to pay for the whole summer's worth of childcare if you're doing camp. I just did it, right? Or sometime in the school year, you're paying in advance a big chunk of money. So there's a really important need for a usefully large sum of money at once. And it can be very hard for people to put that together just by pulling bits and pieces from each paycheck over time. Instead, she over withholds on her taxes, then she gets a huge check in February. And that funds Christmas. It gives her a bunch of cushion to pay down bills and buy something big if she needs to. So we saw lots of strategies like that among the Diaries families, and that was one of the most, everything about this was really rewarding, but it was for me, really inspiring to see how people manage through some very difficult circumstances. And yet the strategies people use don't necessarily work. So, right, stuff goes wrong. So about a third of the Diaries sample at some point was either evicted or threatened with eviction or threatened with disconnection of utilities or experienced disconnection of utilities. About half at some point overdrafted. 3/4 either missed a rent payment or were late on a mortgage or rent payment. And keep in mind, like, these are working households. Like, we're not talking about the poorest of the poor. And yet they're having a very hard time paying basic bills regularly, in full, on time, every month. And so that caused us to think about inequality in so many ways, and to think about how you get people financial security in some different ways. And so here's a place where I will urge you to look at the slide, but go to the next slide after this. So what we thought about is, you could think about financial security along a 2x2 box, where along one axis, we chose the x-axis, you think about how to get people steadier income and spending. And we could have a whole separate, multi-day conference on how to do that. Like, what changes you need to make in the labor market, what changes government needs to make about workers and the power that they have in the labor market. Or you could think about the coping mechanisms that people have to manage that instability. And so there's a lot of work you can do along that x-axis to push people towards greater financial security by giving them better tools and ways to manage their financial life. And really, the tools that we have are very unequally distributed, right? So the people who need great financial services, great advice, are the least likely to be able to get it. At the higher end of the income spectrum, we have lots more innovation around how to insure against ups and downs in your life, or how to invest for the future. But we need more of that thinking down at the bottom. And so I'll leave you with 3 more thoughts about this before opening it up to questions. One is that as we think of how to do that, how to give people those tools, and that's why this is important as you're talking about lending today, right? Because lending is one of the most likely of those tools. As you think about those tools, don't assume, yeah, thanks, you can go, yeah, perfect. Don't assume that it's about education and education alone. Like, the first thing people want to think is, great, financial literacy, we're going to have a course. And that's not the answer. It's just not. So one thing we did is we gave people a standard, we asked lots of questions over this year, and we gave people a standard battery of financial literacy questions. And then we compared that with what their financial life looked like. And what you see is here's, as an example, people know that they should save. That is not the gap. So on average, people in our household, in our study, thought that they should have almost $9,000 of savings, which is, by the way, a huge lift if your income is $50,000 a year, right? So, and that's because this idea that you should have 3 months of spending saved is well understood and has percolated through our society. But when you compare that to the actual savings people have, it's much lower. This is not a knowledge gap. There are specific things that people need information about. So part of the question is, what information are we giving people? Is it the right and most useful information? And I'm certain that often it is not. Because it's not that there's no information gap, but it's not that, if we just deliver this financial literacy curriculum, all will be well. The second thing I would point you towards is that it's not purely about a lack of access to accounts. So over 90% of Americans are what you describe as banked or underbanked, which means they have bank savings accounts and checking accounts, or they're using alternative financial services. Right? There is a wealth of ways to manage your money. And again, like, having a savings account is not a be all and end all. Like, I have a savings account, now I will have savings. But there is incredible range in quality of those products. And that's really where a lot of the work is. Like, how do you create the financial services that are high quality? And I would define high quality as designed to help people achieve their best and most successful financial life. And there's a huge gap there. but it's not purely an access gap. And it's not purely about getting people to move from check cashers to bank accounts. If only it were that simple. But if you're staying for the dinner, you'll hear Lisa Servon talk, and she's going to talk to you about how check cashers play a huge and often positive role in people's lives. It's not as simple as thinking, you know, the services this one institution provides are great, and the services this other kind of institution provides are terrible. It's much more messy than that. And then the last point I'll make is, and I'm going to skip all the slides and go straight to the end, but you can just leave it wherever you want. Thank you so much. Is that a huge part of what's happened here is really a shift in risk. And so the big question to have is, how do you distribute risk across society? What's fair? What kinds of risks do you want individuals to bear relative to institutions and communities? To me, that's sort of the guiding question, or the biggest, I don't know, source of worry that I come out of this work with, is that that's really where we need to focus, and that conversation is really hard. So I'll end there, but I would love to be able to hear your thoughts and take questions about it. Yes, you're proactive and ready.
Thank you very much for that important, if very frightening presentation. I think it's something that we're all aware of, but it really brings it home. You say, I think rightly, that it is systemic. It's not about individual choices. So where does this go to ultimately? Progressive taxation, or living wages, or some way of redistributing the wealth in this country, which is obscenely skewed, or what's the direction? Because clearly the kind of things we're seeing in this new tax code are taking us exactly in the wrong direction.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that, and I'm glad you asked it in that way, because I don't mean to be depressing, and I think we are at a hard moment for this. And when you write a book like the Financial Diaries, right, the standard format is many chapters of what is wrong and then one chapter of what should be done about it, right? That's how those books work. And that last chapter of what to be done about it was really hard to write, because it's tempting to be like, well, we should become a social democracy, you know? Like, from my personal intuition, yeah, we should do a lot more in terms of delivering government services and tax people more, and that would absolutely shift a lot of what we're talking about. But we didn't want to write a chapter that was, you know, just, I think that actually is a demoralizing answer, because we know we're very far from that. We're not headed there anytime soon. And yet there is a lot that can be done that's closer in that really matters. So, for example, I do think that the kinds of financial services that community-based organizations can offer make a big difference in individual and families' lives. I also think that financial technology is a big part of the future and a big part of the answer. So one of the things that CFSI, where I've worked for the last decade, works on is how can we nudge the financial services industry to create the products and services that will actually lead to financial health. And what we've seen in the last decade is extraordinary change in the financial services industry. Lots more financial technology apps, lots more ability to use your personal data in ways that can inspire actually good advice. And I think we are headed in a direction where some financial services companies are going to stake their reputation and their long-term success on building a genuinely trusting and helpful relationship with their customers. And I think that's hopeful. I also think there's a range of things you can do around job quality that would make a big difference. So in San Francisco and in other places, people are working on things like the Retail Workers' Bill of Rights that gives workers more control over their schedules. Which makes a lot of sense to be doing, to think about how you give people predictability and give people the opportunity to choose their schedules. And there's some apps that work for people to share shifts or trade shifts that give me a lot of hope, because the flip side of the volatility is actually a lot more flexibility. And for many people, that is a trade-off they are happy to make. And I'm sure lots of us are regularly quizzing taxi drivers and Uber drivers, and the reality is that the ability to work when you want versus on somebody else's clock, or to have a variable schedule, is something that has pros and cons. Plenty of workers do want that. So my view is we have to be able to look in a clear-eyed way at what our economy is becoming and shape new social services and new safety net structures for the way work is today. We're not going to go back to the previous way of doing it, and we're not going to necessarily model ourselves after Northern Europe. And so what is the American solution to the way that jobs work today?
Well, thank you for opening up a dialogue on possible economic transformation. I like the diary format because I'm a Deweyan. John Dewey said you have to name the problem first before you solve it, so I'm doing a lot of naming of problems through the diary. I would respectfully disagree with this idea that we might, that it's impossible to go the route of the European model. I just think that's a theory, and let's just throw other ideas into the mix. I read my Paul Krugman in the New York Times, and usually like what he has to say. I haven't read much Marx, but I have. What I know about Marx, I got from neo-Marxists, people like Erich Fromm and Herbert Marcuse, who I think would also advocate for more radical solutions to what's happening now. The fact that a socialist candidate for president, Bernie Sanders, is now the most popular politician in America by a far margin. How would we mix that in? And the fact that we have one of the most unpopular presidents who has, his cruelty and his the way he is kind of a sort of a central casting for the evils of capitalism. We could be in a moment when we could really flip this around and create a guaranteed income for everybody, create not just minimum wage, but maximum wage. Why does nobody ever talk about maximum wage? Why do CEOs deserve that kind of salary? And why can't we inject that into the conversation? That's the question. Well, these are a lot of questions in here. So what about more radical possibilities? You seem to have said that they can't happen, and I'm wondering if they can.
Yeah, so thank you. And I should be clear. I think that more radical possibilities may happen. They're not going to happen this year. So you have to be able to think about near term and long term. Yes, right, but they're not going to happen in 2018 either. So I think it's important to have a near term, but that's okay, yeah, but I'm totally happy to own that as my theory. I think that it is absolutely true, right? So I think, so you have to be able to think about long term and near term. And I'm not willing to give up on near term things. I think we have to focus on doable things and I should be clear that even the things I'm describing as doable are very hard to do. So there are doable things that are hard to do, but we could think about in the next 6 to 18 months, and there are things that should be our long-term North Star, but are really not going to happen in the next 6 months, 18 months, 3 years. And I think that it's demotivating to not be able to think about the nearer term also. The UBI issue comes up everywhere. People are very excited about UBI, and I do think that that is in recognition of the fact that people want to hear the bigger, game-changing ideas. Oh, sorry, that's the universal basic minimum. Universal basic income is a proposal that's really being, and that's what I thought you were talking about when you're talking about a guaranteed minimum income. I do think people are hungry for bigger, newer ideas, and it's possible that we will have a backlash from the current political environment that allows us room to offer those ideas and be successful with them. But I'm not fundamentally a political prognosticator, so it's hard for me to say that I believe that to be the case. Maybe. It'd be nice. Yeah.
I have two questions, but before I ask the second one, I need the first one. What is faith-based lending exactly?
A faith-based lending? I'm actually not the best person to answer that, but I'm sure that'll come up.
Right. Then I guess it's about lending and then consumer borrowing. What do you then expect the consumers to do with the money that they borrow? What is the kind of the motive or?
Yeah, so, you know, and I'm glad you asked that question because it sort of forces me to make sure that I'm offering information that does level set for everyone in the room as you then enter into more tactical panels around, the 4 o'clock panel is really explicitly about lending, and I assume we'll get a lot more into this. But I think that when you think about those ups and downs I'm describing in people's lives, and the idea that there's really near-term need for financial management, you have to tackle the idea that borrowing is going to be a part of that. And that there is a role for high-quality credit in people's ongoing management of their financial lives. And credit is fundamentally like the way that people, mostly in the US, have built wealth. If you can borrow and buy a home. That's been one of the largest drivers of wealth creation in America. If you can borrow and invest in an education, if you can borrow and invest in a business. The challenge is that there are also many predatory versions of loan products out there, and credit offerers are generally not incentivized to make sure that you're only borrowing what you can afford to pay back. Right? They're incentivized to gauge whether or not you're going to pay them back, not whether or not this was a good loan for you. And that's a huge gap. And so, you know, I think my goal is to provide sort of a grounding for what is the economic life of many Americans today, that then you can move into conversations about lending with.
We have a couple more minutes. I want to. We are a little short on time, but I know we started late, so I had one more specific question that I wanted to ask you, Rachel, before we take a break and move on to our next conversation. I wondered if did you see anything in your data, the families that you worked with, that was unique or distinctive in New York? I know, like, New York was one of your sites, but you know, our audience is community leaders working almost entirely around the city, and often with immigrant faith communities. So I wondered, were there any particularities to the financial picture of New York families and also immigrant versus non-immigrant families? How do these issues play out differently with different communities, different families?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So, I mean, overwhelmingly what we saw was similar across our sites, in that people are dealing with the same kinds of volatility and the same kinds of insecurity. You know, at a kind of macro level. And I feel like it's important to point that out because so much of our national dialogue in the last year in particular has been about differences, and has been about regional differences and racial differences, and those exist and are important in lots of ways. But in terms of the fundamental, like, sort of economic insecurity people are experiencing, there's a lot that's similar. That said, you know, New York is its own special beast, and so what people spend money on is predictably different than what they spend money on elsewhere. So, you know, you don't need me up here to tell you, look, of course, people are spending more on rent here. They're living in more crowded places as a result, and they are spending less on gas and cars. So, you know, that's sort of the fact of how life is structured here. We did, in our population in New York, we had 2 immigrant communities, one from Latin America and one East Asian, and then one Black community. And the reason it's sort of grouped that way is the way that our research was structured was that we had 10 field researchers, and each field researcher had a group of families they worked with. And so they would be geographically concentrated in order to make that useful, and often of the culture that they were then working with in order to make it easier to build trust and find families to do this with us in the first place. So we had pockets, right? And it was really interesting to see how some of the immigrant communities functioned. Mostly, I ended up thinking about it as the checklist. Like, what's the checklist of things people tell you when you get here? And the checklist is different in different communities. The word of mouth information is different in different communities. And what people are leaving, and therefore what they're coming with, is different. So the East Asian community we were working with, people mostly accumulated several $1,000s before coming here. And they had to have a visa, and they got here with that visa, with that work visa. And so they started out with a little bit more economic security because they were coming with some resources. And they also, and so what we saw was, and there was also like a really, part of the checklist in that community was a lot of credit knowledge. So when you got here, people said, you know, one of the things you got to do is build up a credit score. Right? It was along lines of like, go here to get a job, go there to get, right? Like, that's what immigrants have always done. But one of the things on the checklist is start with a store credit card. That will help you to build up your credit. But you got to pay it off every month, and then you'll get a bank credit card, and then eventually you'll be able to get a mortgage and education loans. And so there was understanding of that, which is actually not the case in all communities. And also, you know, it is a big deal if you're here legally, just because you have more options professionally. And so, you know, the people who we heard as describing, you know, barriers to being able to get traditional employment because of how we're dealing with immigration, and people who are, you know, so like I'm sure there are people in this room who can say more in greater sophistication than I can about those issues, but like, we definitely saw them come up. What we saw in every single community that we worked with was an incredible amount of sharing of resources. And this was not purely an immigrant story. It's a human story. So within our sample, only 95% of the people at some point in the year either borrowed or lent money or saved or gave away resources with some other friend or family member. So this idea that we have of like an atomized nuclear family that operates as a financial unit is really false. Communities are much more interwoven than that, and they're interwoven financially. And one of the ways that plays out is that the East Asian immigrant community, who seemed to come to the country with $6,000 or $8,000, was able to share that money around. Right? So what we saw was that one family we worked with, borrowed 3 different times over the course of the year from friends and family members, and they lent 3 different times over the year to friends and family members. So what was happening was that little nest egg of $6,000 was moving over time to whoever needed it most today in this moment. And that's incredibly powerful. And it's incredibly powerful, but it's sort of a good place for me to end, because it shows the limitations of that, because that can only work up to the financial resources of that community, right? So in the East Asian community, that meant that $6,000 or $8,000 was what you could put together. If you needed 15, that's going to be harder, right? And in communities that we worked with, so we looked at like what is the average size of the friends and family loan in different communities. In other places in our sample, it's only going to be $500 or $1,500. And so, like, I really think, this maybe goes to the point about bigger challenges with inequality and the widening wealth gap, is that you have to figure out how to get more resources into these communities if you're really going to maximize the incredible strength that people bring to working with each other on a local level to solve financial challenges. There's incredible power there, incredible resources there, but you have to be able to figure out how to put more money into the system. So, stop there. Thank you so much for having me.